The document you are reading was never meant to be published. It was compiled in the aftermath of the most catastrophic military failure in the recorded history of the Galactic Council. 11,000 years of recorded history, to be precise, by an archivist named Pale, whose species communicates through bioluminescent pulses along their thorax. Pale had no authority to write this analysis. Pale wrote it anyway. What follows is Pale's attempt to explain, in terms the Council might eventually accept, how 312 space-faring civilizations lost a war to a species that still argued about how to load a dishwasher. The vote took 4 minutes. 4 minutes to decide the fate of 9 billion people across 18 worlds. The motion was filed under Bureaucratic Provision 1187C, Involuntary Sovereignty Transfer of Pre-Tier Species. It had been used 4,810 times before. The language was old, comfortable. The Council chamber on Station Prime held representatives from every member species, arranged in ascending tiers of luminous seating that rose 300 meters into a vaulted ceiling, designed to make everyone feel small and cooperative. Archon Valesi, supreme arbiter for the past 4 centuries, initiated the vote with a single pulse of her forelimbs. The motion carried. No debate, no objection. 1,200 representatives confirmed and moved on to the next item on the agenda, which concerned a trade dispute over mineral rights in the Penna Drift. Pale noted later, in the margin of the official transcript, a single line. Nobody asked what united meant in United Earth. This was the first error, though we did not know it yet. The annexation notice traveled at light speed through 17 relay stations and arrived at Earth's orbital communication hub on a Tuesday. It was a Tuesday because humans organized their time into cycles of 7 days, each with a name, and Tuesday was the one nobody had strong feelings about. The notice was translated into 400 human languages simultaneously. It said, in essence, you have 90 standard cycles to surrender all sovereign authority to the Galactic Council. Your species will be assigned productive roles within the existing economic framework. Resistance is not a meaningful option. Admiral Tejo received the transmission while eating lunch in his office at the United Earth Defense Headquarters in Seoul. Rice, soup, and pickled radish. His aide, a young officer named Bora, burst through the door with the kind of expression that usually meant either a systems failure or a death in someone's family. Tejo looked at her. He finished eating. He read the message. He set down his spoon, placed his napkin on the tray, and said, "Get me everyone." Bora would later tell this story so many times it became something between history and legend. The admiral who finished his rice. It was funny. It was also the most terrifying thing she had ever witnessed, because it meant he had already decided what to do, and the decision lived somewhere beneath the calm surface of a man who would not let an alien empire rush his lunch. What followed was chaos. Beautiful, screaming, profoundly human chaos. The Assembly of Nations convened in Seoul within 36 hours. 40 nation-states, 17 colony governments, 3 corporate sovereignties with their own legal systems and private militaries. And, because humanity could not do anything simply, an anarchist collective from the far side of the moon, who refused to recognize the authority of the Assembly, but showed up anyway, because, as their representative put it, we don't believe in governments, but we believe in not being enslaved. They argued for 6 days. The Council monitored every transmission. Their behavioral analysts, species psychologists who had modeled and predicted the collapse of civilizations for millennia, fed the data into predictive systems older than most human religions. The models were clear. Fragmentation was occurring along predicted lines. Resource-rich colonies would negotiate separately. Corporate entities would seek favorable terms. The anarchists would splinter. Resistance probability held steady at 7.2%. On the 7th day, every faction signed the Compact of Common Breath. Every single one. The corporate sovereignties surrendered their private fleets to a unified command. The colony governments pooled their resources without conditions. 40 nation-states with centuries of grudges, border disputes, and unresolved wars set all of it aside in a single afternoon. The anarchists signed last. Their representative used a pen borrowed from the delegate of the nation they hated most, and said, "Don't read into this." The council's behavioral model flagged the result as a data error, a statistical anomaly. The system recommended rerunning the analysis with corrected inputs, because the inputs were obviously wrong. No species with this level of internal conflict achieved total unity in 7 days. The model had no category for it, so it discarded it. Pale would write, years later, "We logged the compact of common breath as a malfunction in our prediction system. We corrected the model. We did not correct our assumption." 3 levels below the defense headquarters in Seoul, in a room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, Admiral Taeho stood before a screen showing the entirety of human-controlled space. 18 worlds, a combined military fleet of 17 warships, 17, against the Council's standing navy of 900,000 vessels. Taeho did not look at the numbers for long. He pulled up a contact file. A scientist, Dr. Suho, listed under a project that had been defunded twice and reclassified once as theoretical nonsense. Suho worked out of a cramped lab on Busan Orbital, a station so old its artificial gravity hiccuped every 40 minutes. He had been sending proposals to the Defense Ministry for 9 years. 9 years of physics that made weapons engineers laugh and theoretical physicists go quiet. Taeho called him. "Dr. Suho," he said, "you have funding now." There was a pause. "How much?" Suho asked. "All of it." On Station Prime, Archon Valesi received the weekly intelligence summary. Under the section marked, "Earth, Annexation in Progress," a single line had been added by an analyst. "Species displays anomalous unity behavior. Recommend continued monitoring." Valesi deleted the line. Tier 9 species did not require continued monitoring. They required processing. She moved on to the Penadrift mineral dispute. Pale's margin note for this section read, "What follows is the record of a fleet assembled from garbage, crewed by the unqualified, and led by people who had no business surviving. The Council had 40,000 warships. Humanity had stubbornness and welding torches. We considered this an acceptable imbalance." Fleet General Torin was, by every measurable standard, the finest military commander the Council had produced in 600 years. His species, the Varath, were apex predators from a high-gravity world, 7 feet of scaled muscle, with 4 arms and a brain that processed tactical information the way a river processes stone, constantly, patiently, and with absolute erosion of whatever stood in the way. He had commanded annexation fleets 11 times. 11 species had folded under his approach. The average campaign lasted 19 days. He was given 40,000 warships and told to collect Earth. Torin prepared the way he always prepared. He studied. Human military history was publicly available. They put everything on their networks, which the Council found either charmingly naive or deeply stupid, depending on the species doing the judging. Torin read about their wars, all of them. He found patterns that made sense and patterns that did not. Humans valued individual life to an almost paralyzing degree. They built entire legal systems around the sanctity of a single person. And yet, given the right conditions, they would walk into certain death singing. His analysts flagged this as irrational behavioral oscillation, a glitch in the species psychology, exploitable. Torin filed it under known variables and moved on. He should not have moved on. Across human space, something was happening that looked, from the outside, like a species losing its mind. Commander Yuna stood in a docking bay on Incheon Colony and stared at her ship. The Dandelion Seed was a bulk cargo freighter. It hauled grain between colonies. Its top speed was roughly one-third of a Council patrol skiff. Its weapon systems consisted of a forward-mounted debris laser designed to vaporize pebbles. "We're going to fight in this," said Bora, who was 20 years old and had been the ship's cook for 2 years and had never fired anything more dangerous than a pressure cooker. "We're going to fight in this," Yuna confirmed. They welded armor plating to the hull. The plating came from the decommissioned station that had been scheduled for recycling. It was mismatched, ugly, and bolted on with the kind of structural elegance usually reserved for a child's first attempt at building a shelf. The dandelion seed looked like a freighter that had lost a fight with a scrapyard and called it fashion. 4,000 civilian ships across human space did the same thing. Freighters, mining rigs, transport shuttles. A luxury yacht owned by a retired pop star who reportedly said, "If I'm going to die, I'm going to die in something with heated seats." They all reported to the newly formed volunteer fleet under Commander Yuna's authority, which was a fancy way of saying that a cargo hauler captain was now in charge of the most ridiculous navy in galactic history. Captain Hana, meanwhile, had been given command of the 7th Strike Group, which the fleet had already started calling the Strays, because every ship in it was a former mining vessel, and every crew member had the particular kind of insanity that comes from spending years cutting rocks in deep space. Hana was 34, built like a cable under tension, and had a vocabulary that could strip paint off a bulkhead. She thought in 3 dimensions, the way most people thought in 2, because when you mine asteroids for a living, up and down are suggestions, not facts. She looked at the Council's approaching armada on the long-range sensors. She did the math. "Beautiful," she said, and meant it the way a surgeon means it when they see a problem interesting enough to be worth solving. In the deep quiet of Council space, Lieutenant Dohun sat in a cafe on Station Mirith and drank something that tasted like bird flowers. He had lived here for 6 years. Cultural liaison. That was his cover. He spoke 4 Council languages fluently, and 2 more badly enough to be charming about it. He had friends here. He had a favorite restaurant. He had a life that was built entirely on lies, and the lies were so well constructed that sometimes he forgot which parts were real. The annexation order changed everything. Dohun had spent 6 years mapping Council communication relays, fleet supply chains, and most importantly, the Behavioral Prediction Network, the vast computational system that modeled species psychology and predicted resistance patterns. He understood it better than most Council analysts did. He understood its blind spots. He sent 1 encrypted message home, routed through 14 dead-drop relays across 9 systems. The message was 11 words. "They think we will break. Whatever you do, don't break." Then he ordered another cup of burnt flowers and waited. On Earth, in a hospital room in Busan, a young sergeant named Minji sat beside a window and folded a paper crane. She folded it from a page of a letter she had written to her brother, Jinho, who had died 2 years ago in a mining accident on Colony Hanem. She had been writing to him ever since, not because she believed he could read them, because the alternative was to stop talking to him, and she was not ready for that. She had a box under her bunk. 114 cranes. In the old story, you fold 1,000, and you get a wish. She did not know what she would wish for. She suspected that by the time she reached 1,000, she would not need to wish for anything, because the folding itself would have done whatever the folding was supposed to do. Her unit commander appeared in the doorway. "Sergeant, we're deploying." Minji placed crane number 115 on the windowsill. She picked up her gear. Torun's armada entered human space on what humans called a Thursday. 40,000 warships in perfect formation, each one a masterpiece of engineering refined over millennia. They moved like a single organism. They darkened sensors across 3 systems. They were beautiful, the way an avalanche is beautiful, breathtaking and indifferent. Hana watched them appear on her screen, 40,000 points of light, arranged with the precision of a species that had never needed to improvise. She keyed her comm. "All strays, this is Hana. They're here, they're pretty, and they have absolutely no idea what they're walking into." Pael's note for the third section was the shortest in the entire document. 3 words. We were unprepared. The Battle of Morrow Gate was supposed to last 4 hours. Council tactical doctrine was built on a principle called convergent pressure. You bring overwhelming force to a single point. The defender calculates the impossibility of resistance, and surrender occurs before significant casualties on either side. It was efficient, it was civilized. It had worked 4,810 times. Fleet General Torun dispatched his Vanguard, 6,000 warships, to the Morrow transit point, the main corridor into human-controlled space. His sensor arrays confirmed the human defense fleet was waiting. The numbers were almost funny. Roughly 700 ships. Most of them were civilian vessels with welded-on armor that his scanning officers initially classified as debris. Torun opened standard communication channels to accept surrender. Protocol required it. Admiral Tejo's face appeared on the screen. He was sitting in a plain chair. No uniform decorations, no dramatic lighting. Behind him, a shelf with books. He looked like a man who had been interrupted while reading. "Fleet General," Tejo said, "before we begin, I would like to share something with you." He read a poem. It was written by a human poet who had died in a prison cell nearly 200 years ago, a man named Yun Dongju who had written about counting stars and died before he could count enough of them. Tejo read it in Korean, then in the council trade language. The poem was about looking up at the sky and feeling ashamed of having nothing to be ashamed of. Torun listened. He did not understand the poem. He filed it as a psychological delay tactic. While Tejo read, 700 human ships broke formation. They did not retreat. Every ship in a different direction, like seeds thrown from a hand, disappearing into the vast asteroid field that bordered the transit point. Torun's tactical display went from showing a neat cluster of enemy contacts to showing nothing. The humans had dissolved. This was not in the model. Standard doctrine said a fleet that abandons formation has surrendered its only advantage. Scattered ships are isolated ships. Isolated ships are dead ships. Torun ordered pursuit. His Vanguard entered the asteroid field. 12 hours later, 900 Council warships were gone. Not destroyed in battle, destroyed by rocks. Every asteroid in the field, thousands of them, had been hollowed out, packed with mining explosives, and fitted with proximity triggers. Hana's strays had spent 3 weeks carving the field into the largest minefield in human history, using the same tools they had spent their careers using to extract ore. They had not built weapons. They had repurposed their entire profession. Torun pulled his surviving ships back and stared at the tactical readout for a long time. His report to the council contained a sentence that Pael would later highlight as the moment the war changed. "They turned geography into a weapon. Our models do not account for this." The council's response was to send more ships. Humanity's response was Dr. Suho. Suho had spent 9 years in his lab on Busan Orbital, working on something the Defense Ministry had twice defunded and once classified as theoretical nonsense. The project was called Blackthread. It exploited a known flaw in the universal shield harmonics that every Council warship used. A flaw that Council engineers had identified centuries ago and dismissed as theoretically unexploitable, because exploiting it required solving a class of equations so chaotic that no computer in the galaxy could process them in real time. Suho had not used a computer. He had used paper. 9 years of hand-mapped probability clouds, each one a guess refined by the previous guess, building a cascading model of controlled chaos that existed nowhere except in the notebooks stacked floor to ceiling in his lab. His colleagues thought he was brilliant. His supervisors thought he was insane. Both assessments were correct. Blackthread, when deployed, dropped a Council warship's shields for 1.4 seconds. That does not sound like much. In space combat, it was an eternity. A human missile needed 0.3 seconds to reach a shieldless hull. Suho had given them a surplus of over a full second. His engineering team called it the gift. The first Blackthread deployment destroyed a Council dreadnought, a ship the size of a small city, in a single strike. The dreadnought's commander had enough time to register that his shields were down before the ship ceased to exist. The Council had no explanation. Their engineers ran diagnostics for weeks. They found nothing wrong with the shields. The shields had worked perfectly. They had simply stopped working for a length of time that should not have been possible. While the fleet war raged in space, something quieter and stranger was happening on the ground. Colony Haenum was one of the first human worlds the Council attempted to occupy. Standard procedure: orbital bombardment to soften defenses, then ground troops to establish control. The bombardment worked. The ground troops did not. Minji's unit was part of the 1st Orbital Drop Division, deployed to defend the colony's underground infrastructure, the network of tunnels and pipes and maintenance corridors that ran beneath every human settlement like veins beneath skin. The Council sent soldiers built for open field warfare: tall species, strong species, species with excellent vision and superior reflexes. The tunnels were dark, narrow, the ceilings were low, and the people defending them were not just soldiers. Farmers fought in the tunnels. Teachers, mechanics, a 16-year-old who knew every pipe junction in the eastern grid because she had spent her summers helping her mother repair water lines. They fought with mining tools and improvised explosives, and a knowledge of the terrain so intimate that Council troops began reporting that the walls themselves were hostile. Minji fought for 9 days straight. She slept in 40-minute intervals, in crawl spaces too small for Council soldiers to enter. She folded cranes when she could not sleep. Crane 116, Crane 130, Crane 155. The paper was whatever she had: ration wrappers, equipment manuals, a page torn from a book someone had left behind. Council troops started calling the tunnels the throat. Deployment requests to the underground sectors dropped by 60% within the first month. Soldiers from species that had never known fear began to learn the word. Dohon's intelligence network, meanwhile, was waging a different kind of war. From his position on Station Myrith, he coordinated broadcasts into Council communication channels. The broadcasts were not threats or propaganda. They were stories. A recording of Yuna describing her crew, Bora the cook, who made dumplings that could make you cry, and a retired school principal named Gisu, who read to the crew every night before sleep. A letter from Minji to her dead brother, translated into 12 Council languages. A recording of Admiral Tejo reading another poem, this one about snow. The Council had no defense against this. Their communication networks were designed to carry data, orders, and intelligence. They were not designed to carry grief. 12 species formally protested the annexation within the first month of combat. The protests were filed under standard diplomatic objection protocols and promptly ignored by Archon Valesi, who had never, in 400 years of governance, encountered a problem that could not be solved by ignoring it long enough. Torun submitted a revised casualty projection. His original assessment had estimated a 30-day campaign with acceptable losses. The revision had no end date. Where the timeline should have been, Torun had written a single word in his own language that Pale translated as unknown. Valesi read the report. She deleted the word unknown and replaced it with 60 days. She moved on to the next item on her agenda. Pale wrote, by the 6th month, the Council controlled more territory than it had at the start. It held more systems, more transit points, more orbital positions. By every metric we had ever used to measure victory, we were winning. This was the third error. We were measuring the wrong thing. 6 months into the war, the maps looked good for the Council. Blue markers, Council-controlled space, had expanded deep into human territory. Colony after colony had been occupied. Transit corridors were secured. Fleet General Torin's forces held a territorial advantage so overwhelming that on paper the war was already over. The war was not over. It was everywhere. The Council's strategic doctrine was built on a concept their war colleges called conflict geometry. Every war has a shape, a front line, a center of gravity. You identify the center, apply force to the center, and the shape collapses. This principle had governed galactic warfare for 8,000 years. It worked because every species the Council had ever fought organized its resistance the same way. Centralized command, concentrated forces, defensible positions. Humanity did not do this. Humanity's war had no front line. It had no center of gravity. It did not have a shape. It was, as one bewildered Council admiral described it in a private communication that Payel later recovered, like fighting weather. Commander Yuna launched Operation Pollen on a morning she spent throwing up in the bathroom of her quarters. Not from illness, from fear. She had 3,000 civilian ships under her command. Freighters, transports, converted yachts, a passenger liner that still had entertainment systems playing music in its cargo hold, and she was about to send them across an area of space so vast that the Council's entire navy could not patrol it simultaneously. The plan was simple, because it had to be. Each ship would jump to a different Council supply line, attack a single target, a fuel depot, a communication relay, a cargo convoy, and then disappear. One strike, one jump, gone. 3,000 needles in 3,000 different haystacks. The dandelion seed hit a fuel depot on the edge of the Verith home system. Bora, who had been a cook 6 months ago and was now a weapons operator because the universe had lost its mind, fired the ship's single forward cannon. The debris laser Yuna's engineers had modified to something slightly more aggressive and ruptured 3 fuel containers before Yuna pulled them into a jump. They were gone before the Council patrol arrived. Across 3,000 points in Council space, the same thing happened simultaneously. Supply lines that had operated uninterrupted for centuries were bleeding. Not catastrophically, not enough to cripple anything, but enough to make the Council's logistics officers file emergency reports. Enough to make 30 more species question whether this war was worth the disruption to their trade routes. And the Council could not shoot back, because the ships doing the damage were civilian vessels, cargo haulers, grain transports. If the Council fired on them, they fired on a class of ship that every species in the galaxy used for commerce. The political cost was worse than the military damage. 46 species called for ceasefire negotiations after Operation Pollen. Valesi denied them all. Torin, alone in his command quarters, did something he had never done in 11 campaigns. He studied the enemy, not to find weakness, but to understand. He read human history, not the military summaries his analysts had prepared, but the original texts. He read about a place called Vietnam, where a superpower with every advantage lost to farmers in tunnels. He read about Afghanistan, where empires went to exhaust themselves against mountains and stubbornness. He read about Korea, where a peninsula split in half held the entire world at a standstill. He found the pattern. Humans did not lose wars by being defeated. They moved the goalposts, not forward, not backward, but sideways, into dimensions their enemies had not considered. They made the cost of winning more expensive than the cost of walking away. Torin requested 200,000 additional ships. The Council, which was now dealing with internal protests from nearly a third of its member species, granted him 10,000. He stared at the number for a long time. Captain Hana did not wait for orders. She had stopped waiting for orders somewhere around month 3, when she realized that the chain of command was less important than the chain of chaos. She took the 7th Strike Group, 14 ships, all former mining vessels, crewed by people who had been cutting rocks a year ago, on an unauthorized deep raid past every boundary the Council considered secure, straight into their core space. She attacked a shipyard, a cultural heritage facility, where the Council built ceremonial vessels, the great ships used for diplomatic processions, treaty signings, and the formal induction of new member species. Ships that were symbols, ships that meant something. Hana destroyed 4 of them. The military damage was 0. The symbolic damage was a wound the Council had no protocol for treating. Hana broadcast one sentence on an open channel before jumping away. "We know where you live." 46 species had already called for ceasefire. After the shipyard raid, the number rose to 89. On Colony Hanem, the tunnels had been quiet for 3 days. Minji did not trust the quiet. She had learned that quiet in the throat meant one of 2 things. Either the Council had pulled back, or they were bringing something bigger. Her unit, 12 soldiers, a mechanic, and a retired farmer who had volunteered because he said he was too old to be afraid and too angry to sit at home, was gone. Not all dead. Some evacuated, some transferred, some just gone in the way that people go in war, where you turn around and someone who was there is not there anymore, and you do not get to find out why until later, if there is a later. Minji sat in a collapsed section of tunnel, where the ceiling had come down enough to create a small pocket of space, big enough for 1 person. She folded crane number 741. The paper was from a field ration wrapper. Her hands were shaking. They had been shaking for weeks. She folded anyway. The shaking made the creases uneven. She did not care about the creases. She cared about reaching 1,000. A sound. She looked up. A Council soldier stood at the entrance to her alcove. 7 feet tall, 4 arms, scaled skin that caught the dim emergency lighting and threw it back in fragments. He had his weapon raised. The barrel was pointed at her chest. Minji did not reach for her weapon. She did not move. She held the half-folded crane in her scarred fingers and looked at him. The soldier looked at the crane. He looked at the box beside her. The box she carried everywhere, filled with 740 paper birds that meant nothing to him and everything to her. He lowered his weapon. He sat down across from her. He did not understand what she was making, but he watched her fold. And in the silence of the throat, 2 people who are supposed to be killing each other sat 3 feet apart and did not kill each other. And this was either the smallest thing that happened in the war or the largest, depending on what you believe wars are for. Archon Valesi addressed the full council that evening. Her bioluminescent patterns were steady, confident, unchanged. "This is not a war," she said. "This is a Tier 9 species having a tantrum. It will burn itself out." Pale, recording the session from the archivist's alcove, added a note in the margin that would later become the most quoted line in the entire document. This was the last session before the vote of no confidence. She still did not understand. I am not certain she understands even now. Pale's final section began without a margin note. For the first time in the document, the archivist wrote directly, in first person, breaking every protocol the council had for historical records. "I do not know how to write this section as an analyst. I will write it as a witness." The vote of no confidence came on a day that had no particular significance to anyone except the people it destroyed. 187 species voted to remove Archon Valesi from her position as supreme arbiter. She had held the seat for 400 years. She lost it in 11 minutes. The chamber, which had voted to annex Earth in 4 minutes of silence, spent 11 minutes dismantling the architect of that decision. And the noise was something Pale would remember long after the details faded. A sound like a hive collapsing inward, every species talking at once, bioluminescence and pheromones and subsonic vibrations all layered on top of each other in a wall of collective fury. Valesi did not speak during the vote. She stood at her podium and watched her government dissolve beneath her, and her forelimbs were perfectly still. She left the chamber without a word. Pale never saw her again. The war was declared strategically untenable, not a surrender. The Galactic Council did not surrender. It engaged in doctrinal reassessment, which meant the same thing but allowed 11,000 years of institutional pride to remain technically intact. Fleet General Torin was ordered to withdraw all forces from human space. His fleets pulled back from 18 human worlds, from the transit points and orbital positions and supply corridors that had cost him ships and soldiers and 6 months of his life. He watched his armada retreat in formation, still perfect, still precise, still beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they no longer matter. Before the last ship jumped, Torin sent a private communication to Admiral Tejo. It was not sent through official channels. It was routed through a personal relay that Torin had never used for military purposes. The message was brief. I read your poet, Yun Dongju. I think I understand now why you read him before the battle. I do not think I will forget it. Tejo received the message in his office in Seoul. He read it once. He did not reply. He set down his tablet and looked out the window at a city that was still standing because enough people had been willing to make sure it kept standing. And he sat with that for a while, in the quiet of an office that smelled like old coffee and paper. There was no treaty signing, no ceremony, no moment where two leaders shook hands or pressed forelimbs across a table while cameras recorded the occasion for history. The war ended the way most things end, in pieces, unevenly, with some people finding out days after others. Lieutenant Dohan came home on a Tuesday. He had not been on Earth in 8 years. The shuttle landed at Incheon Spaceport, and he walked through the terminal with a bag that held everything he owned, which was not much, because a spy's life is measured in what they can carry and what they can leave behind without flinching. His mother was waiting at the gate. She was smaller than he remembered. Or 8 years had done what 8 years do to mothers who send their children into the dark and wait. Dohun opened his mouth to say something. What he wanted to say was, I'm sorry. What he wanted to say was, I did things I cannot tell you about. What he wanted to say was, I forgot what your cooking smells like, and that was the thing that almost broke me. He did not say any of this. His mother took his hand. She walked into the car. She had made soup. She told him this while they walked, her hand wrapped around his like he was 6 years old, and they were crossing a street. She had made soup because she did not know what else to do, and soup was what she knew. They drove home without talking. The silence was not empty. It was the fullest room Dohun had ever been in. Commander Yuna stood in the docking bay on Incheon Colony and looked at the dandelion seed. The ship had survived Operation Pollen, 3 engagements, 2 emergency jumps that had stressed the hull beyond any rating its original manufacturers would have recognized, and a direct hit from a council patrol that had taken out the port engine and half the crew quarters. It would never fly again. Bora stood beside her. 21 now. She had been a cook when this started. She was still a cook. She had also fired weapons, patched hull breaches, performed field surgery on a crew member using instructions read aloud from a medical manual, and held Yuna's hand during a jump that both of them thought would be their last. We should turn it into a restaurant, Bora said. Yuna looked at her. The ship, Bora said. It's not going anywhere. We gut the cargo hold, put in tables, I cook. People come. Yuna laughed. Not a polite laugh. The kind that folds you in half and makes your eyes leak, and sounds like it was stored somewhere deep and heavy, and has been waiting months to get out. She laughed until she could not breathe, and Bora stood there watching her with the patient expression of someone who had proposed something perfectly reasonable and was waiting for the other person to catch up. They did it. They stripped the cargo hold, installed a kitchen where the weapons locker had been, and put tables between the bulkheads. They named the restaurant Pollen, because Yuna said the ship had already spent its life scattering things across the galaxy, and it might as well scatter something worth eating. Gisu, the retired principal, became the host. He seated people with the same calm authority he had used to manage classrooms for 40 years. On Earth, in a hospital room in Busan, Minji folded crane number 1000. The paper was clean white, the first clean paper she had used in months. Her hands were scarred, the skin across her knuckles tight and shiny where burns had healed wrong. She folded slowly, not because she had to, because she wanted to feel every crease. She set the last crane on the windowsill beside the others. 1,000 paper birds. They filled the sill and spilled onto the table and clustered in small groups across every flat surface in the room, like a flock that had landed and decided to stay. A nurse came in, young, new. She looked at the cranes, and her face did the thing that faces do when they encounter something they were not expecting and do not have a category for. "What are they for?" the nurse asked. Minji looked at the cranes. She thought about the story. 1,000 cranes, one wish. She had started folding them for Jinho. She had folded them through a war. She had folded them in tunnels and hospital beds, and in a collapsed section of the throat while an enemy soldier watched her hands move. "Jinho," she said. "Just his name." The nurse waited for more. There was no more. The name was the whole answer. Archivist Pale completed the document on a night cycle when Station Prime was quiet. The analysis was finished. 3 critical errors, 18 appendices, 247 source citations. It was the most comprehensive post-war analysis in Council history, and it had been written by an archivist who had no authority to write it, and would likely face disciplinary action for producing it. Pale did not care. At the end of the document, below the final appendix, Pale added a personal note. It was flagged as non-canonical, meaning the Council could ignore it, which they almost certainly would. It read, "We made 3 errors. The first was assuming their unity was performance. It was a choice made by a species that fights with itself every day, and chose, for once, to fight together. The second was assuming their warfare would follow rational models. It did not. They fought with poetry and mining equipment, and a cook who had never held a weapon. The third was assuming the war had a shape we could see, and a center we could break. It did not. They were everywhere. They were nowhere. They were in the tunnels and the supply lines and the communication channels, and they were folding paper birds in the dark. But beneath these 3 errors was a single assumption we never thought to question, that a species could be measured, that a civilization's worth lived in its technology, its territory, its tier ranking. We rated them Tier 9. We were correct. By every metric we had, they were primitive, fractured, emotional, and small. They also put a cook on a warship and a poet in command of a fleet. They sent teachers into tunnels and turned cargo ships into weapons, and fought a war that should have lasted 30 days for 6 months without breaking. We had no model for what they were. We have one now. End of document. Archivist Pale. Station Prime. Unauthorized analysis. File however you see fit. The document was filed under restricted access, where the Council intended it to stay.